Here at USC, we are very proud to produce future leaders in a variety of fields. And our next presenter is Jillian Quang, a doctoral student in the USC Annenberg School for Communication. And commenting on Ms. Quang's presentation is no stranger to our conference. We are pleased to welcome back the founder and managing partner of Will Ventures, our good friend, Isaiah Kacyvenski.
Oh, let's go. Nailed it.
All right, so hi everyone. My name is Jillian Quang, and I am a doctoral student at USC Annenberg here. And so with my study, as the previous panel just talked about, there's been a lot of use of these advanced tracking technologies in sports. But one thing that has been looked at less is how these technologies have been used how they've been implemented by teams, athletes, and other relevant stakeholders. And so what we wanted to do with our study was to understand how the devices were being used at every level of sports. And this was to understand how those challenges, what were the everyday challenges, opportunities, and for development in sports. Specifically, our goal was to study individual stakeholder attitudes and opinions and experiences regarding player technology and body-worn sensors in professional sports. And what we wanted to do was to look at differences between the attitudes, between groups, and see what each group wanted specifically from the devices. And so methodology, we had 9 surveys for 9 different stakeholder groups, and each survey asked about goals and priorities for using the technology, important metrics, limitations encountered, as well as thoughts about the widespread adoption in sports. And we are still in the process of collecting data, but today we're going to highlight some of our preliminary results. And so these are 7 of the main stakeholder groups that we were interested in, but today I'm going to present on 5 data from 5 of those groups. So preliminary results. For us, understanding the goals and priorities of using this technology was really important because what you want from the technology, that influences what devices you're going to use, what data you're looking for, and ultimately the conclusions and results that you can draw from. And so what we found was that injury prevention and improving individual performance was the top priority for athletes and general managers. Agents and players associations, they did see that as important, but they also mentioned that they were interested in making money from the devices. And that was sort of in contrast to what the athletes wanted. So that was one. Another thing that we looked at was the concerns. And we wanted to see what were people worried about and how did those concerns stack up against each other. So the top concern was privacy of information. So what was collected and who had access to it. That was the top priority or concern amongst all 3 of these groups. And while accuracy and reliability of data was important for agents and players associations, it did seem to be less of a concern for athletes. And so, privacy is always talked about in terms of the abstract and hypothetical, usually in sports. And so what I wanted to do with this study, I wanted to get a better idea of what people specifically meant when they talked about privacy. So in order to do that, I asked a number of the groups. I'm presenting on 4 of them. So on the left are 4 of the groups that we asked about, and on the top row is basically all the different people that we asked, should those people have access to player data. And if you see a check mark and an X, that means that it was split amongst that group, that there were different opinions. But as a whole, most of the groups wanted to keep data limited very, very small. Everyone agreed that athletes should have access to their data, and as well as the training and medical staff. After that, it was really split depending on who was the person you asked and their interest in their position. Agents seemed to definitely be one of the most flexible groups when it came to data sharing, and even more than players' associations or GMs. And this is in contrast to athletes who had expressed a preference for smaller groups in terms of where the data was shared. And so the last finding that we had, what we wanted to do, is we wanted to track the lineage or the lifespan of data. So was data following players from team to team and being built on over time, or was it stopping and starting with each new team that a player was on? And so this also kind of helped us explore the idea of privacy and whether access to data was translated to every situation. Yes, athletes, everyone thought they should have access, but were athletes getting that access to their data? So in the event of a player leaving a team, we found that agents and athletes were very likely to say that they would ask the team for their biometric data. And so then from there, we asked GMs and team training staff, would, in the event that a player is leaving and they asked for their data, would it be likely that they would receive their data from the teams? And the team training staffs and GMs said it was very unlikely that players would receive it. And on the flip side, we asked general managers if they acquired a new player, if they would request previous biometric data from the team collected about that player. Most of the GMs said that they would not request that information from the team, although one did say that he or she was very likely to request that data and give it to players if they requested it. So what this suggests is the idea that access to data is not necessarily being translated down into everyday situations, and so maybe that should be something that should be talked about or explored more in the future. But just as a wrap up, these are our preliminary results and takeaways, and I just wanted to say thank you to Sports Innovation Lab and Will Ventures and everyone else who helped us distribute the survey and take it. We really appreciate it, and we hope to have the final results sometime in the next year. So, thank you.
So I know we're gonna open it up for questions and discussion. It was an awesome job, Jillian, and a lot of work and really the tip of the iceberg around gathering more and more data. My background also, besides Will Ventures, is focused around sports technology, opening up large adjacent markets such as healthcare, fitness, digital media, IoT, et cetera. And the way that I look at, besides that, having played in the NFL for 8 years, sitting on the NFLPA Health and Safety Committee, and understanding the conversations going on now, going all the way back, and I know we're going to open it up for, again, more discussion, but as an athlete, and Angela could talk about this, we talked about it for a ton, around each player looking at their body as a business. And technology allows us to start to take control, each of us as athletes in that process, whether having come from the league or the team down, having a ground up approach, if you look at your body as a business. And you look at even the things focused on that we discussed around minimizing injury and increasing performance, maximizing that performance envelope, doing that so you can play longer and make more money, as well as just be better at your job, period. This just makes a lot of sense. Technology, it's almost a no-brainer that technology should play a key role in that. And there's a couple of things that have been touched on already around the quality of the data, the contextualization of that data, the usefulness of that data as well. And that's really what it comes down to. And looking at a variety of different measures and understanding also, just at a high level, that not all data is made the same, right? I think we talk about data as some big blob and some data set, but you start to slice and dice different areas around that. In the end, the fear from players themselves can this data ever be used against me? And who gets to see this data that Jillian kind of laid out, right? And then how am I incentivized to share more data if it's fairly agnostic, right? If you start to place various pieces around that. And it's a conversation that's ongoing now. So looking at that same piping across the board that looks at performance and scouting is also going to be very useful in storytelling and digital media, as well as you look at full-on engagement across the board, all the way to to sports betting and a variety of other pieces. It's how you look at that data. You need highly accurate data to tell a complete story, which fully believe, and there's a big difference too, just to kind of throw out to the crowd, just so everybody's on the same page. There's a difference when you're at the facility for 2 hours or 3 hours or however long that is, or on the field, to 24 hours across the day. And that is a big difference around how you look and how you prepare and how you can gather highly accurate data across the board. And I will challenge, as I do every single year, The obtrusiveness, we talked about players, great, you have the most accurate device in the world. Obtrusiveness of device, having a seamless device capturing data is utmost importance. I don't want to have anything interfere with gameplay if you're an athlete, period. They just won't use it. I don't care how awesome it is, how amazing it is. If you feel completely different with it on, you're not going to use it, or it's going to take a lot of getting used to. So that's another very, very important piece of this as well, which is there has to be a utility for that. So those are my general thoughts. I would say across the board, incentivizing players to share more and more for engagement, and giving, as you grow a piece of pie, and allowing them to, change the conversation of no way would I ever share data to actually I'm aligned fully and I can make X amount of dollars more a year if I'm actually sharing my data in a certain way. It completely changes the conversation. I've had those conversations with players across the board, and it's a completely different conversation. And I think Paul highlighted that over there, and he's completely right. That is what's really going to change, and this will really be proven out in those tier 3 and tier 2 sports, and then be brought to those tier 1s, those top-notch leagues across the globe for that as well. So anyway, those are my general thoughts, and I could talk more, but it'd be great to open it up for questions too for both groups, because I'm sure there's a lot of questions out there as well.
Great. So ladies and gentlemen, we have wonderful volunteers who will have microphones, and they will be able to get to you. So as we bring up the lights, particularly on the, great. Please just raise your hand, and our folks will be able to get to you with a microphone, and don't rush. Take your time, and we have a good amount of time here to be able to answer questions before we take our first break.
Can you turn me on here? Hi, Brad. Quick question, because this is kind of a rare time. We have athletes, agents, players associated, and we have a lot of doctors and we have a lot of companies that make very accurate FDA-approved devices who also need to leverage their products over a greater population of patients. There's an implantable device that couple companies here make that could be injected under the skin, that's FDA approved, incredibly accurate, can liberate a lot of technology in that, highest standards of cybersecurity. We could put it in an NFL athlete when they enter the league. We could get a sense of their load over years, their 24/7 sleep, their body position. We could actually do the science, and the technology's there. Don't have to wear anything, and you pop it out afterwards, half of a thumb drive, okay? You can put it in the training room. So that's the real path forward a little bit to discovery. And part of me, as I interact with you all as a cardiologist, I see, the doctors that dominate your leagues are orthopedic surgeons, and I love them, but like they're orthopedic surgeons. So how can we get there? Because that could be transformative. And then you guys who've played could actually sit on an airplane when you're 45 and maybe not just be broken down or use special operations or recon Marines. I mean, then we really get to the point where you've got something left after you're done. Which to me, as an older person and a physician, and knowing these communities, it's really kind of a heartbreaking thing how broken down people are after they do this job, right? So, comments? Well, their number, but one of them is Abbott, and they're in the room. So they've got a device that could actually, could measure the stuff. It wasn't designed for that. It's completely capable of that in an athlete or a warfighter.
I would turn the question around and take it away from athletes for a second. If USC said that as a condition of your employment, you had to have this injectable that they were going to monitor you over the course of your employment, you as an individual would probably react negatively, understandably, especially as this thing continues to develop and it's not widely adopted in the general population. That said, if the framework evolves where an individual sees that this is tremendously valuable to mitigate the long-term consequences of his employment, his or her employment, depending on the sport and the activity, then potentially that individual will adopt something, use it, pull in the necessary resources, and potentially share some select portions of that data with their employer, with their strength and conditioning coaches. So I think we get there slowly with the right protections in place, not to beat a dead horse on that one.
I violently agree with Sean about that. I mean, I talked about it earlier, but it's all about, it's even a broader spectrum. It's about taking control of how you feel, and technology is going to play a major role in that. having full control and opting in and out of how you choose, and you control your data on your body. It's appalling to me even see some of the results of players leaving teams and saying, hey, if you had biometric data, we wouldn't bring it with you. That's crazy to me. I couldn't agree more with that. I will say this, though, there is a big difference between, if you make, you already know this because we've talked about it, but invasive, non-invasive types of technology is a completely different ballgame around that. And obviously, for being studied, the barriers are a lot different for that, as well as the usability, right?
Okay, raise your hand and we will get to you. There's somebody in the corner, whoever is assigned to that corner.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you for that presentation. So I'm from Baxter. We're a medical device company in a very different stage of treating patients than what you guys are describing. And the level of depth and rigor of the data you're describing, if we only had some percentage of that to treat patients with things like end-stage renal disease who we care for today, that would be pretty remarkable. So my question, and I'd love to hear if anyone else has a perspective on this, is how do you go about implementing this technology and encouraging development in less willing populations? If I'm an athlete and I'm making $25 million a year, my job is to stay healthy, I'm pretty incentivized to adopt some of these technologies to ensure performance. But if you're a 75-year-old patient suffering from a variety of chronic diseases who may or may not know their risk factors, but needs to have this type of technology available to them to treat them better, how do you think about adapting this type of technology to those populations? And maybe even this is a topic for later in discussion for the other healthcare companies in the room or physicians in the room, why wouldn't we see more ubiquitous adoption of this technology in more critical type patient populations?
I would say that, the older population, myself included, now getting up there, it's like, I like the technology and stuff because it's quality of life. Is it something that's I can continue to do things with my family, go on trips, do things like that, and travel. So I think it comes down to quality of life, but it's also the population or the background of that patient to begin with. Were they a very active person already? I think it's going to be easy for them to adopt to it because they want to stay active. If you really weren't active before and trying to convince them that you can do more, it's like, well, I didn't do much before. So that might be a barrier there. And I know that's a bigger population of the older population that's sedentary. So I think that's probably the biggest barrier. The active ones, I think that's where you start and prove your point there.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, the idea of, okay, if you have elite athletes where there's a lot at stake and they're willing to wear these devices and have really better understand their bodies for performance, if they're actually willing to talk about that delta, that change, how they become better, and there's a use case, a really visible use case of an athlete taking off and creating a longer career because of it, or preventing injury. And again, why sports is such an interesting pressure cooker for these technologies, because you have that visible platform to tell those stories. Maybe, again, this is just me talking, maybe that will then make its way into, populations that look at these elite athletes and say, wow, they lived longer, they were able to train better and smarter, and potentially could make its way into general health care.
Yeah, Sean, do you have, if you looked at the ledger of positive stories to biometrics and instances where athletes were like, hey, I didn't know this about my body and it's really helped me, compared to hey, they got this wrong and it's ruined this season and I'm suffering playing time. Like, if you look at the ledger, how many positive things have come out with biometrics and how many negative complaints have come out?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think for better or worse, we're more focused on the negative because we're controlling for the lowest common denominator, which is bad actors on the club level, and that ultimately want to use data to make employment decisions for players. And we unfortunately have a number of examples of that, including at the Combine, where they do certain mandatory heart screenings, and false positives results in a guy losing $6 million in the draft. And there's a very public story about that. So there are certainly early adopters who swear by the data use, but again, that's really not are as big of a focus for us. Obviously, as we go down the commercialization path, stressing the positives will be crucial. And to the question, I think it goes to human nature, and it's a tough thing to figure out. And I, for one, am trying to get my diabetic father to stop eating Oreos. So if you figure that out, please, please let me know.
I trained, just as a personal example, Paul did a lot with a group called Exos. They were formerly Athlete Performance, overseeing their VO2. I trained there before my 4th final Olympics. I played longer than any other man or woman in a Team USA jersey. I'm really proud of that. But into later in my career, I needed more data. I needed to better understand myself. And I actually took my game up a level in my last Olympics because of data. So I know it's possible. Is that story communicated? No. But I think, it's about behavioral change. It's about really seeing the data, I think, that could make its way into that.
Okay, great. We have a question in the corner.
Can I just add to that real quick? Just because I spent a lot of time thinking about the specific question, because it adds to what Angela talked about. The great paradox is the most sick actually are studies have shown, multiple studies have shown that they're the least likely to want to take control of their lives, especially with technology. It's crazy. And why that's fallen short. The most elite and the most sick, if you look at it, standing back, should be the most motivated to be able to do that. So it's going to be an amazing story to what Angela talked about, to have that behavior change and make that seamless in a space that there's also studies have shown where you start to prove out in an elite athlete base, the most sick feel intimidated and saying, I'll never be that. That's not me. That might not ever translate over to me, and that's great. They're an elite athlete. That just makes sense to me. Whereas there's a continuous human story, human performance story, that is really about telling a story about each of us in our own way that needs to get communicated in that way. But it's going to be a fascinating next 10 years on trying to do that.
Go ahead, sir.
Okay, great. So I'll start by confessing a reporter's bias, which is I come to this question from a venture capital perspective and looking at how to build enterprise value around some of the things we've been talking about. So if I take the image that Leslie gave us as probably one of the most visionary people that we know, and it's an implantable, completely ambient, completely harmless device that you put on someone, and it yields an immense amount of data. So that's our use case. And I'll just create a personal image from that. So I'm a working professional. I probably am a little crazy and ride a bicycle down the coast from San Francisco to San Diego every year. And I ask myself and my cardiologist, Leslie, gee, is this smarter? Am I doing something crazy? She says, let's put a Zeo patch on you. Let's ride down the coast, and we can watch you for the 7 days you do this, and then we'll try and answer that question. So in that case, the data was very personal. It was between myself and my cardiologist. So against that backdrop, if you look at the research studies, athletes, for the most part, want the data to be quite private. So understandable for all the reasons and all the risks that we talked about. So if I then now go to the question, which is I imagine that data, very rich data, very useful to the athlete and his or her trainer or personal advisor, and it remains in that confidential bucket. But then we create a dashboard that gives simplified layers, and the athlete has the ability to release that layer that's more game-like, that doesn't have the harmful, invasive personal challenges, but yet could be immensely valuable, call it to the sports fantasy football leagues. And so if you begin to envision it in that model, I'd like to hear why something like that wouldn't be a nice starting point as a middle ground for all of this conversation.
I have a company that makes training for medical people, and it's, that makes training using video games for nurses, so all of the Joint Commission training. But what I suggest here is that the big question is, once you use implantable devices or any kind of devices in the general populace, how do you get them to use that information? And what I suggest, for example, my company, you team up the medical community with the insurance people, and then once people watch the video games, their insurance rates go down. and you get them to internalize behaviors, which is what I do.
I think to the question that there's often a time and the place for the type of data collection. I mean, you talk about validation and research versus use and fantasy and the like. And, you know, if you could set up this dashboard that you referenced, could you also guarantee that a club's not going to subpoena player information when there's a contract dispute over an injury guarantee? We've seen concerns about concussion litigation, for instance, where trial lawyers go after every ounce of a player claiming that he had an ailment that was caused by his occupation. And there are some things that are really difficult to protect against, even in the research context. A certificate of confidentiality only goes so far. I think Isaiah raised a really good point, and it ties to the question here. Understanding the difference between somebody who is afflicted later in life as a result of a profession and somebody who does well is probably the crucial sort of overlap that we're all trying to get at here as it relates to wearables and health. We're looking at exactly this through an occupational cohort study with Harvard right now called the Football Player Health Study, where we're looking at the severity of incidents and illnesses suffered by players who played football. It's the largest study of former players in history now, and it's moving from health questionnaires to in-person assessments to do exactly that, confirm the biology of somebody who played 6 years as a third-string lineman and is doing fantastically well in his 50s, and his counterpart, the exact same experience, the exact same exposure, if you will, and is not doing well. And trying to figure out those differences in that data set, I think would be tremendously valuable for everything we're talking about here today.
We're out of time, ladies and gentlemen. Let's thank the panelists and our presenters.